The autumn of 1978 came to Millhaven County the way it always did, slow and deliberate, like a man who knows exactly where he's going and sees no reason to hurry. The hills turned first, the sourwoods going red before the oaks had even thought about it, and the maples along the creek bottoms burning orange and gold until the whole valley looked like something out of a picture you'd see on a calendar and think to yourself, nobody's countryside actually looks like that. But it did. It looked exactly like that. Hank Calloway had watched 47 of those autumns from the same spot, the top rail of the board fence that ran along the eastern edge of his property line, right where the cornfield ended and the old Henderson's timber lot began. He would lean there with his coffee most mornings, watching the ridge line change color day by day, the way his father had done before him, and his grandfather before that. It wasn't that Hank was a sentimental man. His wife Maggie would have laughed at you if you'd called him that. But there were habits that had grown into him over the decades the way bark grows into a fence post if you leave it long enough, and the morning coffee on the fence rail was one of those habits, as fixed and unquestioned as the ridge itself. He was 57 years old that autumn, Hank Calloway, and if you'd passed him on the street in Millhaven, you might not have looked twice. Medium height, a face the color and texture of old saddle leather from 30-plus years under the Tennessee sun. Gray hair cut short and practical, the way he'd learned to wear it in the Army and never saw any reason to change. His hands were the kind of hands that made city people uncomfortable, thick through the palms, scarred in a dozen places from a dozen different pieces of machinery, knuckles the size of small walnuts. He wasn't a big man, exactly, but there was a density to him that made you think of old-growth timber, not the tallest tree in the forest, but the one you'd pick last to fall on. He'd served in Korea with the 2nd Infantry Division, 1951 and 52. He didn't talk about it. He'd come home in the spring of 53, married Maggie Bivens by summer, and spent every day since then on the 340 acres his family had worked since 1902. He'd grown tobacco and corn for most of those years, and it was honest work that paid honest wages if you were careful with your money and didn't mind the kind of tired that settles into your bones around harvest time and doesn't fully leave until April. The farm sat in a shallow bowl between two ridges, the kind of geography that sheltered you from the worst of the winter winds but trapped the August heat until even the crickets sounded irritable. A white-frame farmhouse, 2 stories, screened porch facing south. A hay barn that needed paint every few years and got it. A machine shed made of corrugated steel that Hank had put up himself in 1961 with help from his neighbors Roy Fulton and Cecil Braddock. The 3 of them working 3 weekends in a row, arguing the whole time about the best way to pour the footings. And various other outbuildings, a smokehouse, a small equipment garage, a root cellar that Maggie used for canning, a corn crib, all of them worn and practical, and absolutely nothing that would make the cover of any magazine. The machine shed was where Hank kept his equipment, and in 1978, his equipment was getting old. The John Deere 4430 he'd bought in 1973 was the newest thing he owned. Beyond that, it was a collection of iron that most farmers his age had traded away years ago for something newer and shinier. A 1961 Ford 4000 tractor he used for lighter work, a hay baler from the late 50s that he'd rebuilt twice, and in the far corner of the shed, under a canvas tarpaulin that he oiled once a year to keep it from rotting, his 1955 Caterpillar D8 bulldozer. He'd bought the D8 in 1959 when he was land clearing the back 40, paid $4,200 for it used from a man over in Hardin County who was going out of the dirt moving business. He'd cleared 60 acres with it over the years, pushed fence rows, pulled stumps, graded the access road to the north field after the spring floods of 1964 washed half of it away. It was old when he bought it, and it was genuinely ancient now. The yellow paint had faded to something between cream and rust, and in places the rust had won entirely. The cable drums on the rear were packed with years of dried grease and grime. The blade, a straight-push cable-operated blade, none of your modern hydraulics, hung slightly off-center when it was lowered, an old wound from the time a boulder had come out of the ground differently than expected and slammed the whole machine sideways hard enough to make Hank's ears ring for a week. But the engine ran. He'd seen to that. A Caterpillar diesel engine built when men who built things meant them to last until Judgment Day, and it ran with that particular clatter and throb that old Cat diesels had, a sound that, once you'd grown up around it, felt less like noise and more like a heartbeat. Most people in Millhaven County had forgotten Hank had that machine. The younger farmers had traded up to modern iron years ago, and the equipment dealers who came around trying to sell new gear had learned not to bother stopping at the Callaway place. Hank would listen politely, say, "I'll think on it." And that was the last you'd hear of it. He had his systems and he had his ways, and he had long ago stopped feeling any need to explain them to anyone. That autumn, though, things were changing in Millhaven County whether Hank wanted them to or not. Raymond Sterling Whitfield III arrived in Millhaven in the second week of September in a bronze 1978 Lincoln Continental Town Car that was so clean it looked like it had been manufactured that morning specifically for the purpose of making people feel inadequate. He checked into the Millhaven Motor Lodge, the only motel in the county with more than 12 rooms. And the next morning, he was at the county courthouse with a team of lawyers and a set of plans that had clearly cost more to draw up than most local families earned in a year. Whitfield was 44, from a real estate development firm in Nashville called Sterling Properties Development Corporation, and he had the kind of confidence that comes not from having done difficult things, but from having enough money to hire people to do difficult things for you. He was good-looking in a pressed and polished way, the sort of man who got his hair cut once a week and wore suits that were just slightly too nice for wherever he happened to be standing. He shook hands with the county commissioner and smiled a smile that was all teeth and no eyes. And he said things like projected economic impact, and retail corridor opportunity, and community growth vector, and the county commissioner nodded along and tried to look like he understood. What Whitfield wanted was simple enough, stripped of the language. He wanted to buy up the land just east of Old Highway 46, the state road that ran through Millhaven and connected it to the interstate 12 miles north. The interstate had come through in 1974, and in the 4 years since, the highway corridor had been slowly transforming from farmland and timber lots into the early stages of something else. A motel here, a gas station there, a fast food franchise that still made old-timers shake their heads when they drove past it. Whitfield could see what was coming, and he wanted to be ahead of it. He wanted to build a commercial strip, a shopping center, a couple of chain restaurants, maybe a motel, and the access roads and parking lots that went with all of that. He'd already made deals with 3 families along the 46 corridor, a $600,000 purchase of the old Perkins farm, a $380,000 deal for the Laney timber lot, and a $440,000 acquisition of what had been the Henderson family's 180-acre spread. The Henderson purchase was the important one. It gave Whitfield a continuous parcel of land big enough to build on, running from the highway back into the hills for nearly a mile, bordered on its western edge by Hank Callaway's property line. Hank had heard about the Henderson deal through the normal channels, which is to say, he heard it from Bobby Pruitt at the Texaco station in town, who had heard it from his cousin who worked at the bank the week before it was officially public. He hadn't said much when Bobby told him. He'd finished pumping his gas, paid for it, 67 cents a gallon, up from 59 the month before, the tail end of the second oil crisis making itself felt even this far from anything, gotten in his truck and driven home. That evening, after supper, he and Maggie had sat on the screened porch and watched the heat lightning over the southern ridge, and Hank had said, "Henderson sold." "I know," Maggie said. She usually knew. "Developer from Nashville." "I heard." There was a long silence. The lightning flickered and a whippoorwill started up somewhere in the dark past the garden. "He won't bother us," Hank said finally. Maggie said nothing to that, which was its own kind of answer. There are things on a piece of land that have outlasted every person who ever owned it, and the great white oak stump in the center of what had been the Henderson timber lot was one of those things. The tree itself had been growing on that spot since, by the best estimates of the men who'd bothered to count the rings after it fell, somewhere around 1812. It had been a sapling when Andrew Jackson was fighting the creek or 40 miles to the south. It had been a mature tree, tall, spreading, the kind of tree that made you stop and stare, by the time the Civil War came through the county and tore families apart in ways that took 3 generations to heal. Loggers had passed it up in the 1890s when most of the timber in this part of the county was being cut, because even then it was already so massive and so deeply rooted that the effort of taking it would have been more than it was worth. The Henderson family had farmed around it and occasionally picnicked under it for 4 generations, and in that particular way of old trees on old farmland, it had become less an obstacle than a landmark. a fixed point by which children navigated the timber lot, and fathers gave directions, and everyone unconsciously measured the passage of time. In 1962, a line of summer thunderstorms came through the valley that produced the kind of lightning that doesn't just strike, it detonates. One of those bolts found the old oak on a Tuesday night in July, and by Wednesday morning all that was left standing was a blackened, shattered trunk maybe 15 feet high, the top and most of the crown blown into kindling and scattered across 2 acres of the surrounding ground. Old Earl Henderson, who was 72 at the time and had known that tree his whole life, spent a week cleaning up the debris and said very little about it to anyone. He had the remains of the trunk cut down to a stump about 3 feet high, and there it sat, 8 feet in diameter. The kind of stump that makes modern people think of it as a problem and makes old people think of it as furniture. The root system had been growing into the underlying limestone bedrock for over a century, not just down, but horizontally, weaving through every crack and fissure in the stone for 50 yards in every direction, so that the stump wasn't just sitting on the ground so much as it was part of the ground, grown into it the way a tooth grows into a jawbone. Local people had been calling it the Devil's Stump for years, partly because of its size and partly because of a story, the kind of story that gets attached to any sufficiently old and sufficiently stubborn object, that the lightning which struck the oak had been drawn to it by something malevolent in the wood itself. Nobody quite believed that, but nobody quite disbelieved it either, the way you don't quite disbelieve stories about the dark when you're alone in it. Young Earl Henderson Jr. had tried to pull it with his own D6 Caterpillar in 1965, figuring he could clear that center section of the lot and plant it in corn. He'd hooked a logging chain around the base and put the machine to it with full throttle, and the chain had snapped, not the stump, the chain, with a crack like a rifle shot that was heard at the farmhouse 400 yards away. He'd tried twice more with a longer chain and bigger anchor points and accomplished nothing except bending a frame component on his D6 that cost him $300 to have repaired. After that, the Henderson family had simply left the stump where it was and worked around it. And over the years a certain amount of local legend had grown up around it the way vines grow up around anything that stands still long enough. When Raymond Whitfield bought the Henderson land and sent his survey crew in, the crew chief, a careful man named Davies who had been in this business long enough to recognize trouble when he saw it, had written in his site assessment report, large diameter legacy stump, center parcel. Significant root penetration into bedrock substrate. Removal will require specialized approach. Recommend evaluation before proceeding. Raymond Whitfield had not read the site assessment report in anything like careful detail. He had looked at the topographical maps and the parcel boundaries and the projected traffic counts on Highway 46, and he had told his project manager to clear the site and have it ready for grading by the 1st of November, which gave them about 6 weeks. The first bulldozer arrived on a Tuesday in late September. Earl Dempsey ran the construction crew for Nashville-based Tri-State Site Development, the subcontractor Whitfield had hired to do the land clearing and grading. Dempsey was a competent man in most respects, a stocky, sunburned Kentuckian who'd been in the dirt-moving business since 1959 and had cleared hundreds of parcels across 3 states. He drove a white Ford F-250 with a Tri-State magnetic sign on the door and a CB radio mounted on the dash, and he kept a yellow legal pad on the seat beside him where he wrote his daily notes in a cramped, practical handwriting. His crew arrived with 2 pieces of equipment, a John Deere 850 crawler dozer, a machine that had cost, new, a little over $180,000, and a hydraulic excavator for trench work. The 850 was the state-of-the-art in 1978. It had a fully hydraulic 6-way blade, a turbocharged diesel that produced 270 horsepower, and a sophisticated hydraulic system that could exert enormous force with precision control. It was the kind of machine that made old-timers shake their heads at how far things had come. Dempsey had pulled plenty of stumps in his time. He looked at the Devil's Stump and he saw a big, ugly problem, but not an unprecedented one. He had his operator, a young man named Gus Tarrant, go at it straight on. Gus was 26, competent, and completely unafraid of the stump. He pushed the 850's blade into the ground at the base, got it low and tight, and began to push. The machine growled and walked forward, and the hydraulics built pressure, and for a moment it seemed like it might work, like the thing was going to give. And then the hydraulic line on the right side of the blade circuit blew. It didn't just leak. It failed catastrophically, the high-pressure line rupturing at a fitting near the cylinder, sending a spray of hydraulic fluid across the machine and the surrounding ground with a sound like a gunshot followed by a sustained hiss. The pressure in those lines ran to over 3,000 psi, and when they let go, they didn't ease off. They went all at once. Gus had the machine shut down in seconds, but the damage was done. The line had to be replaced, and the nearest supplier for that specific fitting was in Nashville, and getting the part delivered and installed was going to cost most of a day. Dempsey wrote it up on his legal pad, ordered the part, and told his crew to work on tree clearing in the other sections while they waited. He didn't mention it to Whitfield that evening when Whitfield called from his motel room to ask about progress. He said things were on schedule. The replacement line arrived the next morning, and Gus had it installed by noon. That afternoon, they went back at the Stump. This time, Dempsey had Gus approach from a different angle, from the southeast, where the ground was slightly higher and they could get more of the blade under the root mass. The result was different, but not better. This time, instead of a hydraulic line, it was the blade pivot itself that gave out. The immense resistance from the root system, those 100-year-old roots running through and around the limestone, twisted and braided together into a matrix that was, in its own organic way, stronger than reinforced concrete, transmitted its force back through the blade assembly in a torquing motion that the hydraulic cylinders couldn't compensate for fast enough. The left side of the blade dug in and held while the right side pivoted outward, and something in the blade mounting geometry went beyond its design tolerances, and there was a deep metallic groan that everyone on the site heard clearly, and when Gus pulled back the blade was visibly deformed, bent maybe 4 inches out of true along its left third, a piece of hardened steel that was supposed to be straight and was no longer straight. That was the end of the John Deere 850 for this job. Dempsey stood and looked at the bent blade for a long time without saying anything. Then he went to his truck and called Nashville on the CB. Whitfield came out to the site that Friday morning, and for the first time, the easy confidence in his expression was not entirely solid. He stood in his clean slacks and his jacket, slightly too nice for a muddy construction site, and looked at the John Deere 850 with its ruined blade and at the Devil's Stump, which had not moved at all, not so much as a millimeter, and he said, "I don't pay for excuses, Earl." Dempsey kept his face professionally neutral and said, "No, sir. I'll have a second machine here Monday." The second machine was a Caterpillar D9G, rented from a dealer in Chattanooga at considerable daily expense. The D9G weighed over 100,000 pounds and pushed with a force that could, under normal circumstances, move almost anything. Its blade was hydraulically controlled with redundant circuits, and Dempsey had the hydraulic lines double-checked before they started. The D9G's operator was a man named Walt Briggs who had 20 years of experience and had moved more earth than most people would ever see in their lives. Walt looked at the stump and looked at the ground around it and paced around it twice with his hands in his pockets, and then he said to Dempsey, "That root system goes way deeper than it looks." "I know it," Dempsey said. "You want me to try to undercut it?" "Excavate around it first. Cut some of the lateral roots with the excavator. Try the direct approach first. We'll excavate if we have to." Walt shook his head slightly, not in refusal, just in the way an experienced man shakes his head when he knows something isn't going to work but has been told to try it anyway, and climbed up into the cab. The D9G was an impressive machine to watch work. Even from 200 yards away, you could feel the ground vibrate when it moved. Walt pushed the blade in low and hard, the turbo diesel spinning up with a roar that you felt in your chest, the 100,000-pound machine walking forward with the inexorable weight of a small mountain. The stump held. Walt backed off and came in from a different angle, pushing harder. The machine's track spun and caught and dug trenches in the earth around the work area. The diesel exhaust stacked black against the pale October sky. The stump held. On the third approach, Walt tried to get under the root mass by driving the blade downward at a steep angle, using the machine's weight as well as its push force. The blade went down hard, and for a moment the root mass shifted, just a fraction, just enough to make everyone watching hold their breath. And then the hydraulic system reached its pressure limit on both primary circuits simultaneously, and both main lines failed. Not with the single gunshot of the first failure, but with a double bang that sounded, one of the workers said later at the diner in town, like two cannons going off side by side. Walt had the machine shut down before the second echo had died. The spray of hydraulic fluid had covered the entire front of the machine and a 15-foot circle of ground around it. Dempsey stood with his legal pad and didn't write anything for a long moment. Walt climbed down from the cab and took off his hard hat and walked over to where Dempsey was standing, and they both looked at the stump, which sat in its depression of disturbed earth exactly as it had always sat, with the absolute indifference of something that has existed for 166 years and does not feel the need to be impressed by machinery. 2 lines, Walt said. I can see that, Dempsey said. The third machine, this was now the second week of October, was another John Deere, a 1050 this time, brought in from a job in Georgia because it was the largest machine in the regional fleet and because Whitfield was now paying premium rates and using language that made dealers move quickly. The daily rental cost was $3,400. The lost workdays were compounding. Whitfield had contractors scheduled and concrete suppliers lined up, and every day the site sat uncleared cost money in ways that multiplied. The third attempt was more methodical. The excavator was brought in first to dig around the stump's perimeter, exposing the top layer of root structure and cutting the smaller lateral roots with a hydraulic breaker attachment. This took 2 full days and revealed exactly what Earl Henderson Jr. had encountered with his logging chain in 1965, the main root system, 4 or 5 enormous roots the diameter of a man's thigh, going straight down into the bedrock and then spreading horizontally through the limestone cracks in every direction, growing through the rock itself in the slow, irresistible way that roots have when they've had 160 years to do it. They cut what they could reach. They used the hydraulic breaker on the surrounding stone to try to free some of the lateral roots. They worked around the perimeter for 2 full days, and then the John Deere 1050 came back and pushed. And this time, with all the prep work done, with the lateral roots cut and the surrounding earth disturbed, and the machine at full throttle and the operator, a specialist Dempsey had called in from Nashville, a man said to be the best in the region with a blade, pushing with everything the machine had. The stump moved. It moved about 6 inches, and then it stopped. And then the hydraulic system began to fail, not catastrophically this time, but in the way that pressurized systems fail when they have been pushed to their absolute limits for too long. Fittings weeping, seals beginning to leak, the fluid level dropping, the system temperature rising. The operator backed off, pushed again. The seals got worse. After 40 minutes, Dempsey called a halt, and they discovered that the main hydraulic pump had burned out. Not a line failure this time, but the pump itself, the heart of the system, seized by heat and overwork. The stump had moved 6 inches. 6 inches in 3 machines, 6 inches in 2 weeks, 6 inches at a cost approaching $50,000 in rental fees, repairs, and lost time, before you counted the labor. Whitfield drove out to the site that Thursday evening and stood in the fading light looking at the devil's stump, and for the first time, Raymond Sterling Whitfield III did not look like a man who had the situation under control. He looked like a man who has found something he can't buy his way past, and the experience was visibly new and visibly unwelcome. How much? He said, and Dempsey knew he wasn't asking about the pump. To pull that stump? I don't know. We may need to blast. Blast? Whitfield said the word flatly, as if tasting it. How long would that take to arrange? A week to get the permits. Another week to get the crew. Maybe. I don't have 2 weeks. I'm paying interest on the construction loan every day this sits. Dempsey had nothing to offer him. They stood in silence for a moment, and the October wind came off the ridge and moved through the dead grass around the excavated perimeter of the stump, and somewhere on the other side of the fence line, a quarter-mile away, a light came on in the window of the white farmhouse on the hill. Word travels at its own speed in a rural county, and it travels fastest of all through people who have nothing to do with the parties involved. By the second day of the second hydraulic failure, half of Millhaven County knew that the Nashville developers' big fancy machines couldn't pull the devil's stump. By the time the third machine's pump gave out, the story had acquired the weight of local legend, passed along over coffee at the Millhaven diner and across the counter at the hardware store and through the crackling CB airwaves between the farmers who worked the roads. Hank Calloway had been watching the operation from his fence line most mornings with his coffee, the way he watched everything else, without apparent expression or judgment, just looking. Bobby Pruitt, who came out to the Callaway farm twice a week to help with maintenance work and who had taken to stopping at the construction site on his way, reported back to Hank in the evenings with the kind of detail that a young man who grew up around equipment naturally notices: what machines they were running, how they were approaching it, what had failed and why. Hank listened without comment and went back to whatever he'd been doing. But his eyes, when Bobby talked about the hydraulic failures, had a particular quality. Not smugness, nothing so obvious as that. Just a kind of quiet recognition. The look of a man who has known something for a long time and is watching the world catch up to it. It was on a Friday afternoon, the day after the third machine's pump failed, that Hank walked over to the construction site for the first time. He'd been meaning to check the fence line anyway, he told Maggie, which they both understood was not entirely the whole truth. He found Whitfield there with Dempsey and two other men, talking in the clipped, tense way of people who were spending money they hadn't planned to spend. The Stump sat in its pit of disturbed earth like it had been waiting for everyone to finish having opinions about it. Hank leaned on the fence rail between his property and the Henderson land, his old neighbor's land. He still thought of it that way, and looked at the scene for a while. Whitfield noticed him eventually and came over, and Hank could see the man assessing him the same way Hank was assessing the situation, quietly, taking inventory. "Help you," Whitfield said, and the word help had an edge to it that suggested he doubted it. "Just looking," Hank said. "I'm the neighbor." He extended his hand over the fence rail. "Hank Callaway." Whitfield shook it. "Ray Whitfield. I know who you are." Hank looked past Whitfield at the Stump. "I see you've been having some trouble." Whitfield's jaw tightened briefly. "Temporary setback. We're evaluating options." Hank nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he was thinking. He was quiet for long enough that Whitfield, who was a man who filled silences, began to speak again. "If you're worried about the development affecting your property value, I want to assure you that." "I'm not worried about my property," Hank said. "I was going to ask if you wanted help with the Stump." Whitfield looked at him, looked at the old farmer in his work clothes, the worn canvas jacket, the jeans that had seen better days, the boots that were exactly what they looked like. "What kind of help?" "I've got a machine," Hank said. "An old Cat D8. Cable operated. I've pulled stumps before." There was a short silence, and Whitfield's expression shifted in a way that was small, but not small enough. A flicker of amusement that he didn't quite suppress. Dempsey, standing behind Whitfield, looked down at the legal pad in his hands. "Mr. Callaway," Whitfield said, in the careful tone of a man choosing words for someone who might not understand large ones. "We've already broken 2 hydraulic line sets and a pump on 3 machines that together represent close to $600,000 in equipment. I appreciate the offer, but I don't think a vintage bulldozer is going to." "I'm not offering for free," Hank said. That stopped Whitfield. "I've got an irrigation ditch on my north field," Hank continued. "Concrete liner's been cracking for 10 years. I've been patching it with what I've got, but it needs to be relayed. 160 feet of 2-inch concrete channel. Your crew could do that in a day." He looked at Whitfield steadily. "You hire this crew to do it, I'll pull that stump." "And if you can't pull it?" Whitfield said. Hank thought about that for a moment, which was not because he didn't have an answer, but because he believed in giving questions their proper consideration. "Then you lose nothing but an afternoon watching an old man try," he said. Whitfield looked at Dempsey. Dempsey had the expression of a man who has nothing left to recommend and knows it. "What's this D8 of yours?" Whitfield asked. 1955, straight blade, cable operated. D8 Series M. Whitfield clearly had no idea what that meant. He looked at Dempsey again. Dempsey cleared his throat. "The old cable-operated cats," he said slowly. "They don't have hydraulics. The blade runs on mechanical cables and a drum winch. They're built heavier than the modern hydraulic machines because they don't have the precision control. It's all brute force and mechanical advantage." He paused. "They're also a lot slower, and a lot harder to operate." "But," Whitfield said, hearing something in Dempsey's tone. "But," Dempsey said, "there's no hydraulic system to fail. And the mechanical advantage on those old cable systems." He stopped, seemed to decide something. "Mr. Callaway," he said, "you think your machine can pull that stump?" "I think it might," Hank said. "I don't know for certain. Nobody can know for certain until it's done. But I know how that stump is rooted, and I know what my machine can do." There was a silence. A crow called from the tree line. Whitfield's Lincoln was parked at the edge of the cleared area. its bronze paint bright and incongruous against the mud and torn earth of the construction site. An irrigation ditch, Whitfield said. 160 feet of concrete channel. Your crew will know how to do it. Takes a day, maybe a day and a half. Whitfield looked at the stump. He looked at his watch. He did the mental calculation of blasting permits and delays and the interest on his construction loan accumulating at $400 a day, and the calculation had only one answer. Deal, he said. They didn't write anything down. In Millhaven County in 1978, a handshake over a fence rail was still a contract, and both men knew it. Hank drove back up to his farm and went to the machine shed and pulled the canvas tarpaulin off the D8. He stood and looked at it for a while in the way you look at something you haven't really looked at in some time, but that you know as well as you know your own hands. The machine was enormous, even by the standards of crawler tractors. The D8 was one of the largest production dozers Caterpillar had made in the post-war decade, and its sheer mass was apparent even sitting still. The tracks were wide and double-groused, designed for exactly the kind of work that required maximum ground contact and pulling force. The blade was a straight push blade, not an angle blade or a six-way. Nothing fancy, just a wall of steel, 7.5 feet wide and nearly 3 feet tall, hung on the front of the machine by a push-arm structure that contributed significantly to both its weight and its strength. And then there was the cable system. That was the thing that made the 1955 D8 different from everything that had come after it. Instead of hydraulic cylinders controlling the blade, there were drums, mechanical cable drums mounted at the rear of the machine, driven by a power control unit, a separate engine-driven winch mechanism that Caterpillar had engineered specifically for controlling implements on large crawlers. The cables ran from those drums forward along both sides of the machine and connected to the blade's control arms. And when you operated the drums, you raised and lowered and angled the blade through the pure mechanical advantage of cable and drum, not through the physics of pressurized fluid. It was slower than hydraulics. It was less precise. It required a different kind of touch, not the immediate, responsive control of a hydraulic system, but a feel for the cable tension, for the drum's grip, for the mechanical forces running through the machine. It was, in the vocabulary of 1978, obsolete. But there were things it could do that hydraulics couldn't, and the principal one was this: it could not blow a line. There were no high-pressure lines to rupture, no seals to fail, no pump to burn out. When the cable-operated D8 reached the limits of what the cable drums could hold, it simply stopped, the drums slipping instead of the lines failing. And within those limits, the mechanical advantage was absolute and unforgiving. The machine weighed 53,000 pounds fully equipped, and when the drum was locked and the engine was at power, the force being transmitted through those cables was delivered with an efficiency that hydraulics, for all their precision, could not match in pure sustained pulling scenarios. Hank had understood this for 20 years, which was why he had kept the machine when every equipment dealer in 2 counties had told him he was foolish to do so. He checked the engine first, the way he always did: oil, coolant, fuel, belts. He checked the cable drums, inspecting the cable for wear and the drum mechanisms for anything that had seized in the years since the machine had last worked hard. He found a seized drum bearing and spent 40 minutes replacing it with a spare he kept in a wooden box on the shelf above the workbench. He inspected the push arms and the blade, checked the track tension, checked the final drives with the particular attention of a man who has no desire to be embarrassed in front of half the county. The engine started on the 4th try, not bad for a machine that hadn't run in 18 months, and settled into that rattling, throbbing diesel idle that was, to Hank's ears, as familiar as a voice. The exhaust stacked blue and then cleared to the clean white gray of a diesel running right. He let it warm up for 20 minutes, listening to it, feeling through the operator's seat for anything that didn't feel right. He worked the cable drum under light load, running the blade up and down and checking the tension in the cables, listening for anything that pinged or chattered or felt wrong. It took him most of Friday afternoon and all of Saturday morning. On Saturday afternoon, he went inside and sat at the kitchen table and told Maggie what he'd done. Maggie put down the dish she was drying and looked at him for a moment. "You sure about this?" she said. "No," Hank said, "but I think it'll work." "What if it doesn't?" "Then it doesn't. He doesn't owe me anything, and I haven't lost anything." He picked up his coffee mug. "The irrigation ditch needs fixing either way." "Word's going to get around," Maggie said. Word's already gotten around, Hank said. She turned back to the dishes. After a moment she said, I'll make a pan of biscuits for Tuesday. Hank looked at her. Tuesday. I imagine there'll be people, she said, in the tone of a woman who has been reading her husband correctly for 30 years. She was right, of course. She generally was. By Monday evening, half the county knew that Hank Calloway was going to try to pull the devil's stump with his old 1955 cat, D8, on Tuesday morning. And the other half found out by 7 o'clock Tuesday morning when the trucks started pulling off Highway 46 onto the rutted access road to the old Henderson land. They came in pickups, Ford F-100s and F-150s, Chevrolet C-10s, a few older models that had been repainted twice and still showed rust at the wheel wells. They came in station wagons with children in the back who'd been told to sit still and hadn't. Roy Fulton drove his International Harvester all the way from the other side of the county and arrived before 7:30. Cecil Braddock came with two of his sons, and the Braddock boys leaned against the truck bed and drank coffee from a thermos and watched the proceedings with the particular alertness of young men who have grown up watching their father do difficult things with heavy machinery. The Hardwick brothers came together, as they always did. The two retired school teachers from town, Miss Ida Pruitt and Mrs. Lorene Gallagher, came in Lorene's Oldsmobile and stood at the edge of the crowd in their fall coats with the proprietary interest of women who have lived in a county long enough to care about everything that happens in it. Bobby Pruitt was there early, of course, having been at the Calloway farm since 6 to help Hank drive the D8 the half-mile down the road from the farm to the construction site. He drove Hank's pickup behind the machine with the flashers going, keeping the few early morning cars from coming up too fast behind the slow-moving crawler. A couple of people driving to work had slowed and rolled down their windows to watch the old machine crawl along the road, and at least two of them had turned around in the next driveway and followed it to the site. Word had a way of doing that in a county this size. Whitfield arrived at 8 with Dempsey and two of his crew, and when he got out of the Lincoln and saw the assembled crowd, 40 people already, with more arriving, something in his expression shifted. He had expected a private transaction. This was something else entirely. Dempsey came and stood beside Hank near the D8, which was idling at the edge of the cleared area, and looked at the machine with the professional assessment of a man who has spent his life around heavy equipment. He was quiet for a moment. I haven't seen one of these running in years, he said. Runs fine, Hank said. You know what you're doing? Dempsey asked it as a genuine question, not condescension. I think so, Hank said, which was, for Hank, practically boastful. Dempsey nodded slowly. He studied the cable drums, the blade, the push arms. He studied the stump in its excavated pit, 50 yards across the cleared ground. You're going to do it slow, he said. It wasn't a question. That's right. Not try to yank it. That's right. Dempsey was quiet for another moment. The root system is still running into the limestone, he said. Deeper than I could dig. The main tap root goes down 8, maybe 10 feet, and then forks. But we cut every lateral root we could reach. I know what's in that ground, Hank said. I've farmed next to that stump for 20 years. Dempsey looked at him, looked at the machine, looked at the stump, and then, surprising both of them, he said quietly, I hope it works. Hank looked at him. So do I. In the crowd, someone had brought a transistor radio, and you could hear a country station playing faintly, Waylon Jennings, or maybe it was Willie Nelson, the sound too thin and distant over the diesel idle to be certain. Children ran between the legs of the adults and were periodically retrieved. Somebody had brought a lawn chair. Mrs. Gallagher was passing around a bag of peanuts with the calm authority of a woman accustomed to organizing community events of all descriptions. Two men near the fence were having a quiet argument about whether the old D8 would manage it, and 3 more men nearby were listening without appearing to listen, which in Millhaven County was simply the normal way of things. Whitfield stood apart from his crew, watching. His hands were in his jacket pockets, and his expression was carefully assembled into one of neutral observation. But his eyes moved between the old machine and the stump and back again, and you could see the arithmetic running continuously behind them. The loan interest, the schedule, the things he'd told people back in Nashville that he'd deliver. At 8:30, Hank put on his gloves. They were leatherwork gloves, brown and stained dark with grease and oil, and the particular accumulation of years of hard use. Supple in the way that only very old gloves get. Broken and past the point of stiffness, past the point of new. to something that fit the shape of his hands so precisely they were more like a second skin than a covering. He pulled them on with the practiced motion of a man who has performed this action 10,000 times without thinking about it, flexed his fingers once, and climbed up onto the D8. The machine was old and did not have the comfort features of modern equipment. There was a seat, a flat steel pan seat with a thin rubber pad that had hardened with age, and there were two steering clutch levers and the gear shift and the throttle, and on the right side the controls for the cable drum and the blade lift. That was it. No cab, no climate control, no hydraulic joysticks with multiple functions. The October air moved freely around the operator's position, and you could smell the diesel and the disturbed earth and the autumn in equal measure. It was, depending on your point of view, either deeply uncomfortable or the only honest way to operate a machine, with the weather and the noise and the world around you instead of sealed off from them behind glass. Hank sat still for a moment with the machine idling under him. And if you were watching closely enough, and several people in the crowd were watching closely enough, you might have seen his eyes close for just a second, the way a man's eyes close when he is listening for something that isn't a sound. He put the machine in gear. He drove it forward slowly, across the cleared ground toward the stump, the tracks laying their pattern in the disturbed earth, and the D8 moving with that particular crawler tractor motion, not rolling, exactly, but walking, each track link coming down and grabbing, and the machine advancing with a deliberate, measured weight that was nothing like the urgent power surge of the modern machines. The crowd quieted as he moved. Even the children stopped running. He didn't approach the stump from the front, the way all three previous machines had done. He approached from the side, the northeast side, specifically, angling toward it, so that when he lowered the blade and pushed it into the ground, he was not hitting the stump directly, but inserting the blade diagonally under the root mass on its far side, using the blade not as a ram, but as a wedge and lever. The angle of approach was calculated, though nobody watching could have explained the calculation exactly. It looked, to an untrained eye, simply like an old man driving an old machine to the wrong spot. Dempsey watched this and said nothing, but he took a step sideways to get a better angle, and his yellow legal pad went under his arm. Hank drove the blade into the ground at about a 45-degree angle to the stump's root axis and began to lower the cable, using the drum to increase the downward pressure slowly, not all at once, but easing it down by increments, feeling through the machine for the resistance of the root mass beneath the blade. He was not pushing yet. He was listening. The machine settled as the blade loaded. You could see the tracks compress slightly into the earth. The diesel's idle note changed, deepened just fractionally, as the machine accepted the load. He stopped there. He sat for what felt, to the watching crowd, like a long time, though it was probably 30 seconds. He was feeling the ground. Through the seat, through the steering clutch levers, through the whole 53,000-pound mass of machine under him. He was feeling what was in the ground below, where the root resistance was greatest, where the blade had found the edge of something solid. What angle of force would follow the natural geometry of the root system rather than fight it? He was reading something that had no instrument panel, no gauge, no readout. Something that lived only in the accumulated knowledge of a man who had operated this machine on this kind of ground for 19 years. Then he engaged the power control unit. The cable drum began to turn. At first, nothing visible happened. The drum turned, and the cable tightened. You could see the sag go out of the forward cables, and the machine sat there and ground and held, and the stump sat there exactly as it had always sat. The diesel's note deepened further as the load increased. The exhaust stack put out a thin dark plume that the morning wind took sideways. Someone in the crowd exhaled loudly. Someone else said something too quiet to hear clearly, though the word nothing was audible. Hank did not increase the throttle. He did not push harder. He kept the drum turning at exactly the same rate, the cable taking up the same incremental tension, and he kept the track drive engaged at low gear, not to push the machine forward, but to maintain the ground anchor, to keep the machine planted so that the cable drum could do its work against the mass of the earth itself. He was not trying to move the machine. He was trying to make the machine immovable, to turn it into a fixed point around which the cable tension could accumulate and build the way water builds behind a dam. This was the difference. This was the thing that none of the modern machines had done. The hydraulic machines had attacked the stump. They had applied sudden, massive force. Enormous pressure built in an instant, transmitted through fluid at 3,000 pounds per square inch directly to the blade. That force was tremendous, but it was also instantaneous and directional, and the stump's root system, which was not brittle but enormously tough, had simply absorbed and redirected that force and let it dissipate into the surrounding limestone matrix. Or, in the cases where it couldn't dissipate fast enough, reflected it back through the blade into the machine's hydraulics, which then failed. What Hank was doing was different. He was applying force slowly, continuously, in a direction that followed the natural geometry of the root system, and he was maintaining that force for as long as it took, using the mechanical advantage of the cable drum to convert the engine's torque into a continuous, sustained pull that the root system could not simply absorb and release. He was giving the roots time to fail, and all materials, given sufficient sustained stress over sufficient time, eventually fail, even the ones that can absorb a sudden shock without flinching. He was not trying to break the stump. He was trying to outlast it. 5 minutes passed. The cable drum continued to turn, the increment so small it was nearly invisible. The diesel held its deep, working note. The machine sat planted and steady. In the crowd, a couple of people shuffled their feet. One of Cecil Braddock's sons looked at the other and raised an eyebrow. 10 minutes. The first sound came at about the 12-minute mark. A deep, subterranean groan, felt more than heard, that ran up through the cleared ground and into the feet of everyone standing nearby. 2 children grabbed their parents' hands. A dog that had come along with one of the families backed away 3 steps and whined. The stump had not moved, but something below it had shifted. Some joint or stress point in the root matrix had yielded, fractionally, for the first time. Hank heard it. You could see it in the tiny adjustment he made to the drum control. Nothing dramatic, just a slight increase in the turning rate, matching the force increase to the change in the root system's resistance profile. He had felt something in the geometry below, some fault line in the root mass, and he was following it the way water finds its way through the lowest point. 15 minutes. The second sound was different, sharper, and from beneath the surface on the machine's side, a crack, muffled by soil, like something breaking deep in the ground. And then another, and then a sustained creaking that was not mechanical but biological, the sound of old wood fibers under extraordinary tension being stretched past the point they were designed to hold. It was a sound that raised the hairs on the back of your neck not because it was loud, but because it was wrong. It was the sound of something ancient and fundamental coming apart. The stump moved. Not much. An inch, perhaps 2. The top edge of the stump, the weathered, blackened surface that had been sitting in the open air since 1962, tilted about 2 degrees toward the machine. The crowd made a sound, a collective sharp inhale, and went absolutely silent. Dempsey took a step forward without realizing he'd done it. Hank did not react visibly. He kept the drum turning. He increased the track drive very slightly, not pushing the machine forward, but deepening the ground anchor against the rising tension in the cable system. The diesel deepened further, working now in earnest, the turbocharger, a retrofit Hank had done himself in 1967, a modification that had raised eyebrows at the time and that nobody had thought about since, spinning up audibly. 20 minutes. The sounds coming from the ground were continuous now. Creaking, cracking, a bass note of compression that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The earth around the stump's perimeter, the area that Dempsey's crew had excavated, was moving, just slightly, as the root mass below shifted. Small chunks of limestone appeared at the excavation edges, pushed up from below by the moving roots like something trying to surface. The sight of it, stone moving because of wood, because of the force that had been accumulating in those roots for 166 years and was now being redirected, was genuinely strange, and several people who had been watching with mild interest were now watching with their full attention, because this was not the kind of thing you saw every day or perhaps in a lifetime. Whitfield had come forward through the crowd without being aware of it, standing now at the inner edge of the onlookers, his hands out of his pockets. Beside him, without either of them having planned it, stood old Roy Fulton, who had known that stump since he was a boy, and the 2 men stood together and watched the ground move, the Nashville developer and the county farmer, and for a moment there was nothing between them but what they were both seeing. And then the main root let go. It wasn't an explosion, like the hydraulic lines had been. It was a progression, a deep, sustained tearing sound from 10 feet underground that built over about 15 seconds from a groan to a crack to something that everyone present would later struggle to describe accurately. Several people tried, like a tree falling in a forest, except from underground. Like something enormous waking up and turning over. Like the earth itself changing its mind about something it had held on to for a very long time. The stump came up. It came up slowly at first, 1 inch, 2, the root mass breaking its adhesion with the limestone in sections as the lateral roots freed themselves, and the main roots tore loose from the fissures they had grown through over 166 years. Then faster. The stump tilted and rose and the earth around it bulged and cracked and a section of the excavated wall collapsed inward as the root mass lifted. And then, with a final massive tearing sound that seemed to shake the air, and that was heard, it was later reported, from the parking lot of the Texaco station, half a mile away on Highway 46. The whole thing came free. The stump rose from the ground on the end of the taut cable, trailing torn roots and clods of limestone mixed earth. Hanging for a moment at an angle in the October morning air, 8 feet of ancient white oak stump, the root mass below at 6 feet deep and 7 feet across, the whole thing together weighing, by Dempsey's later estimate, somewhere between 8 and 12 tons. It hung there for a moment like something that had been underground so long it had forgotten what the sky looked like. And then Hank brought the machine forward another 4 feet and lowered the drum cable. And the stump came down on its side on the cleared earth with a thud that raised a cloud of dust and sent the dog running at a full gallop across the field without stopping until it reached the fence line. Then the diesel went back to idle. The crowd was absolutely silent for about 3 full seconds. Then Roy Fulton let out a yell that probably reached the highway. Cecil Braddock's 2 sons started laughing and hitting each other on the arm the way young men do when they've seen something extraordinary that they'll be telling their own children about. Someone started clapping and someone else joined, and within 10 seconds the whole crowd was making the kind of noise that a crowd only makes when it has witnessed something it did not entirely believe it was going to witness. Bobby Pruitt had taken off his hat and was standing with it in both hands, staring at the stump lying on its side in the dirt, and his expression was the expression of a young man who has just learned something about the difference between power and wisdom that no school has ever been able to teach adequately, and that some men never learn at all. Dempsey walked forward slowly and stood next to the root mass and looked at the fractured limestone embedded in it, pieces of bedrock that had been locked around those roots for a century, still clutched in the wood fibers, gray and white against the dark root wood. He said nothing at all for a long moment. Then he turned and looked at the D8 with Hank still sitting in the operator's seat, and Dempsey nodded once in the way that one person who understands a difficult thing nods to another person who has just done it. No words. No elaboration. Just the nod, which was enough. Hank climbed down from the machine. He pulled off his gloves and folded them into his jacket pocket. He walked around to the stump and looked at it lying on its side, root mass up, the root system fully exposed for the first time in 166 years. Great twisted cables of wood wrapped around and threaded through broken chunks of limestone, brown and pale and extraordinary in the morning light. Something that had been growing in the dark for longer than anyone alive could remember, now lying in the open air. He looked at it for a while without saying anything, in the way of a man who has a great deal of respect for old things even when it is his job to move them. Whitfield came through the dispersing crowd and stood beside Hank, and they looked at the stump together without speaking for a moment. Then Whitfield said, Well, Hank said. There was a silence that was not unfriendly. Whitfield was a man who understood deals, and a deal had been made and honored, and whatever he might privately think about old farmers and worn canvas jackets, he was not a man who reneged on his word when it had been fairly given. I'll have Dempsey's crew at your ditch Thursday, he said. 160 feet. I'd appreciate that, Hank said. Whitfield looked at the stump one more time. Then he looked at the D8. Then, and you could see it was not an entirely comfortable thing for him to say, he said, How'd you know it would work? Hank was quiet for a moment. The crowd was thinning, people heading back to their trucks, the morning's excitement done and the day's work waiting. The October air was crisp and carried the smell of the disturbed earth and the coming winter, and a few of the early turning leaves drifted down from the maples along the creek. I didn't know for certain, Hank said, but the hydraulic machines were fighting the stump. You can't fight something that's been rooted in limestone for 160 years. He paused, watching a leaf come down. You have to stay with it. Keep steady pressure. Follow the grain of it. He looked at the stump. Old trees don't break easy, but they do break if you're patient enough. Whitfield stood with that for a moment, and something in his expression was different from what had been there before. The easy, professional smoothness still in place, but behind it, a flicker of something more honest and less comfortable, like a man glimpsing something through a window he hadn't expected to look through. You've been farming this ground a long time, he said. All my life, Hank said. My father before me. His father before him. Whitfield nodded. He started to say something else, then didn't. He turned and walked back toward his Lincoln, and Hank watched him go, and that was more or less the end of it. The tri-state crew came on Thursday as promised and relayed the irrigation ditch on the north field. They did it in a day and a half, using good 2-inch concrete channel and doing it properly, and Hank walked the finished channel with the crew chief and nodded and said it looked right. He went inside and got a 6-pack of Pabst Blue Ribbon from the refrigerator and brought it out, and the crew chief and his 2 men drank a can each in the cooling late afternoon air, and they didn't talk much, because there was nothing that particularly needed to be said. Work had been done and done well, and that was its own sufficient conversation. The development went ahead. By the following spring, the old Henderson land had been graded and the first foundations were going in. A strip mall that would eventually contain a hardware store, a real estate office, a laundromat, and a fried chicken franchise that would serve the lunch crowd from Highway 46 for the next 20 years. The Devil's Stump was gone, cut into pieces by a chainsaw and hauled away. The hole it left behind filled and compacted and eventually covered over by the blacktop of a parking lot. Standing in that parking lot in later years, you would never have known anything had been there. That is generally how it goes. Hank's farm did not change. The cornfield on the north side grew up to the new property line, and the new property line was, for better or worse, now a commercial development instead of the timber lot that 4 generations of Hendersons had worked. It was not the same as it had been. It would never be the same as it had been. But the farm was still the farm, the white house, the hay barn, the machine shed with the D8 back under its tarpaulin, and the irrigation ditch on the north field ran water properly for the first time in years, and in the spring the corn on that 40 acres came up straight and even and vigorous, and that was what mattered. That was what had always mattered. Word of what had happened with the D8 spread through the county, and then further, the way good stories do when there's enough truth in them to keep their shape through the retelling. Bobby Pruitt told it at the Texaco station, and his version had somewhat more drama than the actual event, which is the natural right of the young man who was present. The essential truth of it survived intact. A farmer over in the next county called Hank to ask about the cable-operated blade mechanism, and they had the kind of technical conversation that equipment men have, full of specific numbers and part references and the particular satisfaction of 2 people who understand the same difficult thing, in which words like remarkable and impossible were not used, because men who work with machines find the remarkable considerably less remarkable than men who don't. Earl Dempsey, who went on to manage other projects across the region through the 1980s, mentioned the Millhaven Stump job in a talk he gave to a construction industry group in Knoxville in 1980. He said, "We had 3 machines in 2 weeks and $50,000 in damage, and an old farmer with a 25-year-old cable-operated Cat D8 did it in 23 minutes. The lesson isn't that old is better than new. The lesson is that the right tool for the job isn't always the most powerful one. And the man who knows the ground is worth more than the man who has the biggest machine." Nobody in that room in Knoxville had any idea who he was talking about, and Hank, who was told about the talk by Bobby Pruitt the following spring, said only and went back to checking the spark advance on the Ford 4000, which had been running rough on cold mornings. Whitfield's commercial strip was moderately successful, which meant it paid back his investment, and some, but not the windfall he'd projected. The interstate corridor developed more slowly than the projections suggested, and several franchise deals fell through when the recession of 1980 hit, and the interest rates under the new Fed policy climbed to levels that made even the boldest developers blink. By 1983, Whitfield had moved on to other projects in other counties, and the strip mall on what had been the Henderson land managed its own modest commercial life without him, the way most things do once the person who built them has moved on to something else. There is something that people who have spent their lives working land understand about it that is difficult to explain to people who haven't. Something about the relationship between patience and force, between what you can push through and what you have to wait out, between the kind of power that makes a great deal of noise and the kind that doesn't make any noise at all. Hank Calloway was not a philosopher. He did not think in terms of lessons or metaphors. He thought in terms of soil type and drainage and equipment maintenance and weather patterns and the price of corn at the co-op in October. But if you'd asked him that day, or any other day, what he had actually done with the D8 and the devil's stump, he would probably have said something like, "I knew what was in the ground. I'd been living next to that stump for 20 years. I knew what it was. And that, really, was the whole of it. He knew what was in the ground because he had been paying attention for a long time, in the way that the land requires you to pay attention if you're going to coexist with it, not just looking at it, but feeling it, through your feet and your hands and the seat of a machine and the behavior of water in a rainstorm, and the way a field drains in early spring and the direction a root system tends to grow in this particular combination of soil and limestone and seasonal moisture. It is the kind of knowledge that cannot be written in a report or encoded in a projection model. It lives only in accumulated time and close attention. The developer had looked at the land and seen a problem to be solved with maximum force applied as quickly as possible before the loan interest could accumulate. He brought the most powerful machines available and pointed them at the problem and told them to push, and the land had broken those machines the way it breaks everything that doesn't understand what it is. Hank had looked at the land and seen something he already knew. The difference was not cleverness. It was not technology, old versus new. It was time. It was the accumulated time of a man who had lived on a particular piece of ground and paid attention to it and let it teach him, year by year and season by season, the things that can't be read in a survey report or a topographic map or a site assessment. His father had known the same ground, and his grandfather before that, and each of them had added their own layer of understanding to what the land could teach, and Hank had inherited all of it along with the acreage and the farmhouse and the board fence along the east edge of the cornfield. There is a line from a poem that a schoolteacher recited once at the Millhaven County Fair, in the shade of the exhibition tent on a hot August afternoon, when Hank was half listening and eating a fried pie, and the line was, "The land belongs to those who know how to read it." He didn't remember the poet's name, but the line had stayed with him the way certain things do, not because they're new ideas, but because they're true ones that the world keeps needing to be reminded of. The devil's stump had been in the ground for 166 years. The machines that tried to pull it had been in existence for a handful of years each, built with the newest technologies and the full confidence of the most productive industrial economy the world had ever seen. The D8 had been in Hank's keeping for 19 years, and before that in the keeping of a man over in Hardin County, and before that it had come from the factory in Peoria, Illinois, built by men who were building things the way you build things when you believe they ought to outlast you. Permanence is a virtue the modern world has largely stopped believing in. In 1978, standing at the beginning of an era that would spend the next several decades demonstrating the costs of that disbelief in ways both large and small, Millhaven County got one brief, unambiguous demonstration that some things last because they were made to last, and that patience and steadiness and the wisdom of long attention are forces more durable than hydraulic pressure at 3,000 psi. Not many people took the lesson. Most of the crowd went home and talked about it for a few weeks, and then moved on to other things, because that is what people do with most things. The developers developed. The farms, one by one, continued to go the way of the Henderson place. Bought and cleared and built over. The fence rows pushed out, and the old trees cut down, and the limestone beneath filled with the footings of things that would themselves be torn down inside 50 years. The world moved the way it moves, indifferent to what individual old men know and have always known. But the irrigation ditch on the north field of the Calloway farm ran properly for the first time in years, and the corn grew well on that 40 acres, and every spring for the next 12 years, until Hank's back finally made the decision for him that age makes for all of us sooner or later. He walked that ditch in the early morning and watched the water run through the good concrete channel. And the water ran straight and clean the way water runs when the channel is right, and that was a satisfying thing to see before the day's work started. Maggie told the story of the D8 and the devil's stump to their grandchildren when they were old enough to sit still for it. And she told it the way good stories should be told. Plainly, without embellishment, with all the right details in the right order, letting the truth of the thing do the work rather than dressing it up in anything extra. The grandchildren grew up and moved away, as grandchildren do, and carried the story with them the way you carry the things that were given to you before you were old enough to understand their value. Sometimes forgotten for years, then surfacing without warning in the middle of some modern difficulty, and suddenly making perfect sense. The D8 is still there, if you went looking for it. Under its tarpaulin, in the machine shed, the canvas grown stiff and dark with years, the engine waiting with the patience of iron. The diesel in the tank would be old and bad by now, and the batteries long dead, and there would be rust in places that weren't rusted in 1978. But the block is iron, and the drums are steel, and the cables are still on the spools. And if you drained the old fuel, and put fresh oil in it, and charged up a battery, and primed the injection system the way Hank showed Bobby Pruitt how to do one October afternoon, the engine would start. Old things, properly made and properly kept, do not simply stop working. They wait.